Introduce our speaker, Dr. Judy Wu. Dr. Wu teaches in the Department of History at Ohio State University. She received her PhD from Stanford University, where she also earned her AB and AM degrees. She has received many awards, including being named as Top Young Historian by the History News Network, and an Outstanding Teaching Award from Ohio State University. Her recent book is called Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards, The Life of a Wartime Celebrity, published, I believe, by University of California Press. Dr. Wu's research focuses on borderlands, between races, between cultures, between genders. And her presentation today is part of that interest, centering on a fascinating character who inhabited many different worlds. From White Woman's Burden to Orientalized Motherhood, the strange career of Dr. Mom Chung. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Wu.
I'd like to thank the people who invited me to come. This is actually the most imposing room I think I've ever lectured in. So I will try to rise to the occasion. Let me see if I can put this on larger view for you. During World War II, Mom Chung's was the place to be in San Francisco. Soldiers preparing for departure to the Pacific arena of war or on leave from their duties could eat good comfort food there to their heart's delight. They consumed vast quantities of barbecue ribs, red beans, and chocolate cake to make up for the dreariness of military fare. They swapped stories with each other over drinks at the bar. They also caught glimpses and actually talked with the foremost celebrities of their time: John Wayne, Ronald Reagan, Tennessee Williams, Helen Hayes, Sophie Tucker, Tallulah Bankhead, and many others. At Mom Chung's, they met prominent politicians and military leaders like Kentucky Senator and future Commissioner of Baseball Happy Chandler, and Fleet Admiral of the U.S. Navy Chester W. Nimitz. Mom Chung's was not a restaurant or a nightclub. It was the private residence of Dr. Margaret Chung, the first known American-born woman of Chinese descent to become a physician. She hosted these weekly Sunday parties for 75 to 100 people at a time in her modestly sized home. Then in her 50s, she cooked the food herself and made the rounds to ensure that her guests felt welcome. After all, almost all of them were members of her adopted family. The celebrities, the politicians, the highly ranked, and the common soldiers were bound to each other through her, their surrogate mother. Their ties stem not from blood connection, but from their mutual affection and common dedication to the Allied cause. Chung's family, which grew to approximately 1,500 members, served as a vital political resource during the international conflicts of the 1930s and 1940s. She recruited pilots from her sons for the Flying Tigers, the American volunteer air force that fought in support of China during the Sino-Japanese War. Once the United States entered World War II, she used her contacts to lobby for the creation of WAVES, the Women's Naval Reserve. Described as a serious, commanding, almost regal person, and this is one of her favorite pictures from that time period, Chung nevertheless had a body sense of humor. Because she never married and could offer no legitimate father figure for her mostly white and male children, they became known as Mom Chung's fair-haired bastards. Chung's maternal persona and surrogate family raised intriguing questions regarding the nature of American wartime race and gender relations. Many historians have chronicled the ways in which World War II created unprecedented opportunities for women and some racialized groups to gain entry into the economic, social, political, and even military realms previously reserved for the central constituents of the American polity, namely white men. In fact, scholars of Chinese American women tend to characterize the war as a catalyst for long-term gender and racial integration. At the same time, historians also document the resistance that emerged in response to the demands for public service that necessitated alterations to daily life and threatened traditional social roles. This talk examines Chung's attempts to redefine the boundaries of the imagined American nation by creating a fictive kinship network that modeled appropriate wartime gender and racial responsibilities. She gained recognition during World War II because she demonstrated the mutuality of advocating for greater inclusion while maintaining hierarchical social roles. Chung's decision to create an idealized vision of family to symbolize the national polity illustrates the conceptual importance of kinship for making the racial and gender boundaries of the national community. In Benedict Anderson's formulation of the nation as an imagined community, he argues that the nation is imagined because all communities larger than primordial villages of face-to-face contact will never know most of their fellow members. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. Because women and racialized groups historically constituted peripheral members or outsiders to the nation state, the process of incorporation necessitated either increased face-to-face contact or a reinterpretation of existing relationships to foster a sense of political communion. The claims of biological, conjugal, and surrogate kinship foster this process of incorporation. For example, the tradition of maternal activism in the United States allowed women to claim cultural and political citizenship based on their abilities as biological and social reproducers of the American citizenry. Similarly, Chung's fictive kinship network, through the process of adoption, incorporated individuals of Chinese ancestry previously deemed ineligible for immigration or naturalized citizenship into the American and allied family. This explicit articulation of the personal realm of kinship as a model for the public demands for national and international unity was essential in the context of World War II. Because a total war required the mobilization of private resources and intrusion into the private lives, American participation in the Allied cause entailed the merging of the public and the private. This talk will examine the origins of Chung's use of symbolic and fictive kinship relationships, as well as the significance of her surrogate family in fostering wartime inclusion. I first will discuss the maternalist legacies of white female missionary reformers among Chinese Americans during the late Victorian era. Second, I will examine the ways in which these female interracial surrogate family networks operated within the progressive medical circles that provided professional opportunities for Chung. Finally, I analyze how Chung facilitated certain forms of inclusion and exclusion through her performances of wartime motherhood. Excuse me. I seem to have missed one of my slides. The slide that you should be seeing is a picture of Margaret Chung's mother, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her. Chung's use of adoption as a strategy for gender and racial incorporation represents a legacy of the largest American women's movement during the turn of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the missionary enterprise. White, middle-class, and native-born women constituted the overwhelming majority of the many thousands of female missionaries and their 3 million supporters. However, the movement also sought to empower immigrants and non-whites, especially women of color, both in the United States and abroad. To counter anti-Chinese hostility and restrictions against female education, white Victorian reformers adopted young girls of Chinese ancestry, essentially forming interracial surrogate families to facilitate immigrant adaptation and female advancement. The missionary movement both relied upon and challenged Victorian practice of gender separatism, immigration exclusion, and segregation. Women's traditional roles as maternal figures justified their entry into male professions such as medicine, and their travels across racial and national boundaries. Fears concerning racial mixing were minimized by emphasizing the end goal of training native helpers, who could then serve people of their own ancestry. The missionaries believed in the inherent superiority of their offerings and sought to impose their values on others. However, their cultural imperialist project, which corresponded with the rise of economic, military, and political forms of imperialism during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, also provided opportunities for Margaret Chung's mother to escape a life of sexual exploitation and inspired Margaret Chung herself to become a physician. One of just 9,000 Chinese women to immigrate prior to the passage of the 1882 Exclusion Act, Margaret Chung's mother, Ah Yang, was 5 years old when she arrived in the United States in 1874. It was fortunate for her that she arrived a year before the passage of the Page Law, which prohibited the entry of women for, quote, criminal or demoralizing purposes. If she had arrived after 1875, immigration officials most likely would have denied her entry. Because of the racial hostility towards Chinese and the prevalence of prostitution among the predominantly male Chinese immigrant community, American officials enforced the page law so strictly that all Chinese women were considered immoral unless they proved otherwise. Furthermore, Ah Yang was very likely a prostitute in training. Poor families in China sometimes resorted to infanticide, abandonment, or selling their children in order to survive times of extreme distress. Because Chinese society valued sons for their ability to carry on the family lineage, parents tended to sell their daughters, either as domestic servants or as prostitutes. Being sold as a servant, then, represented a form of charity for impoverished families. The deeds of sale usually stipulated their release at the age of 18. However, during their servitude, girls received no wages, did not have the liberty to leave, and had no legal recourse against mistreatment, rape, or forced marriage. In the United States, these young girls frequently worked as domestic servants in wealthy Chinese households or in brothels. While some owners treated these servant girls or moi tsai well, providing education as well as arranging marriages, others exploited the labor and vulnerable status of the girls. In fact, brothel owners often purchased young girls from China with the intention of using them first as domestic servants and then as prostitutes when they became older, thus maximizing their investment. Ah Yang appeared to be on this trajectory when she was rescued by white reformers concerned about the sexual servitude of Chinese girls and women. Around the age of 11, 6 years after her initial arrival in the United States, she was arrested in a San Francisco brothel and placed in the Presbyterian Mission home. Ah Yang's early years in the United States did not treat her kindly. Margaret Culbertson, the first superintendent of the home, recalled Ah Yang's initial arrival there. She was, quote, small of stature, miserably clad in dirty garments, and in her flight had lost one of her shoes. She also was suffering from a severe cough and catarrhal difficulty. Ah Yang's experience was not unique. During the same year that she arrived at the mission home, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty for Children also placed 7 other girls there. From the perspectives of the reformers, these girls had been portrayed by their biological parents as well as by the surrogate guardians within the Chinese American community. Consequently, the mission home, with the support of the American legal system, provided alternative maternal figures and an alternative family. For Ah Yang, the mission home offered her shelter, education, and a means to develop her leadership skills. Established in 1874, the institution represented a concrete manifestation of maternalist reform ideology. Like most of the 19th century female reformers, the founders and supporters of the mission home subscribed to Victorian values of true womanhood. They believed in women's inherent purity and sought to exert a motherly authority over the broader society. In San Francisco, these benevolent women targeted so-called Chinese slave girls for rescue. Although the mission home reformers wanted all Chinese slave girls, they preferred saving the younger girls. The older prostitutes, accustomed to making money, disdainful of housework, and as a rule too old for school, were generally more critical of the home and especially its regulations on its residents. Consequently, the missionaries explained that, quote, while our doors are closed against none who seek our protection, we are especially glad to receive the children, for good seed sown in the fertile soil of childhood give promises of fruit in later years. A preference for admitting Chinese younger charges facilitated the white reformers' efforts to develop surrogate family relationships. The Presbyterian Mission Home, like other female missionary institutions, wanted to create an ideal Christian household. Due to the belief in the superior moral authority of women, their family was not led by a male patriarch, but by the purity and love of a maternal figure. The superintendent of the home, or matron, was called mother. The Chinese residents generally referred to one another as sisters. Trusted native assistants eventually could ascend to the title of auntie, but never as mothers. The use of familial language served multiple purposes. From the perspective of the matrons, most of whom were single women, their status as surrogate mothers justified their professional and missionary responsibilities as an extension of traditional gender roles. Furthermore, the rhetoric of family both acknowledged racial and cultural hierarchies between white Christian mothers and their Chinese heathen daughters, yet also softened these potential conflicts by emphasizing the emotional bonds between family members. From the perspective of the Chinese women, the use of familial terms to describe unequal relations of obligation and reciprocity resonated with Chinese practices of social protocol. Furthermore, the rescued women recognized the value of cultivating surrogate family ties with white female missionaries who had access to the economic, cultural, and legal resources of American society. While some Chinese women chafed under the maternal supervision of the mission home, Ah Yang appeared to blossom under the guidance of her rescuers. 3 years after her initial arrival, the missionaries reported a transformation of Ah Yang's physical, mental, and spiritual health. Quote, "What a change of 3 years of home care and comfortable living they have made. In looking at her tall, well-rounded figure and intelligent face, fresh with the glow of health, one can scarcely recall the visage of the unpromising little waif that sought shelter with us one dark October night in 1880. She speaks English very sweetly, reads, writes, and sings well, and is studying music under the guidance, under the direction of her teacher. Ah Yang publicly professed her faith in Christ and was received into the church at the last communion session. Although the Presbyterian missionaries certainly had reason to portray the changes in Ah Yang in an advantageous light, they often published these type of transformation stories in their monthly publications to solicit more support for their endeavors. Ah Yang's own words and actions reveal that the portrayal is not an inaccurate one. The 1885 Occidental Board Report featured a letter from Ah Yang thanking the Secretary of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children for rescuing her. "My dear Mr. Hunter, if it were not for you to bring me in the mission home, I don't know where I would be now. I've learned how to read and write and to keep house. I'm studying geography and arithmetic. I hope God will help you to bring more little girls to the home so they can be happy and learn about Jesus. May God bless you and give you more strength to work for him and reward you when you leave this earth. Your Chinese friend, Ah Yang." These expressions of gratitude represent a form of payment for the rescued women, the form of payment that rescued women could provide their rescuers. However, for Ah Yang, her articulations of obligation did not stem solely from calculation, but also from a sincere conversion to Christianity. This transformation of Ah Yang allowed her to become a native helper, a term applied to one of a handful of ethnic minority women who were selected by the mission home women to serve as trusted assistants. She served as a secretary to the Tong Ok, or Lighthouse Band, a missionary society organized by residents in the mission home to support proselytizing work abroad and at home. Ah Yang also assisted the efforts to rescue other Chinese women by serving as an interpreter. In this capacity, she accompanied Margaret Culbertson and other mission home reformers to prisons and courts throughout California. The rescue missions were emotionally trying endeavors. Frequently, the owners of prostitutes attempted to thwart rescue efforts by using legal maneuvers and threatening physical abuse. In addition, traveling outside the confines of the mission home also attracted the hostile attention of some white Americans. Ah Yang apparently faced these emotionally tense circumstances with poise. The missionaries report that while serving as an interpreter in Sacramento, she, quote, "made a favorable impression upon the court by her ladylike, ingenious manner, which the judge himself expressed his pleasure at her intelligence." During Ah Yang's residence in the mission home, she gained the skills and confidence not only to challenge abusive gender relations in the Chinese community, but also to navigate the legal and social institutions of white America. So this is the slide that comes to the second section, which is entitled Maternalist Medicine. Margaret Chung learned the benefits of these benevolent yet hierarchical fictive kinship relationships through her mother's experience as well as her own medical career. At an early age, Chung expressed the desire to become a medical missionary, a goal heavily promoted by Christian reformers who sought to encourage all women, including native helpers, to develop the skills of ministering to the body with the ultimate aim of to reach the soul. Despite the poverty and racism of the Chung family, she eventually attended and graduated from the Medical College of the University of Southern California, an institution founded by Methodists who also subscribe to the goals of training missionary leaders. I won't go into great detail about her medical education, but I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of this talk. But I was very struck by this particular picture. I don't know if you can tell where Margaret Chung is, but she's right in the middle, in the front row. And as you can tell, she's very much trying to blend into her environment. She's the only woman, and she's the only non-white individual in this particular class. By the way she's dressing and by her hair, you can see the ways in which she is trying to physically integrate into her environment. Although Chung never served as a medical missionary in China, the transformation of these religiously inspired strategies for female and racial advancement among progressive scientific leaders helped establish her professional career. When Chung graduated from the medical college in 1916, she was unable to obtain an internship, a position increasingly crucial to modern medicine. As the profession became defined by the development of specializations in hospital-based healthcare, graduates were expected to serve as unpaid interns and then as paid residents before establishing their own practices. However, most hospitals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries denied female and black doctors the opportunity for postgraduate training. The only other woman in Chung's medical class, and this is a couple years after this particular picture was taken, Agnes Scholl did not secure an internship by graduation either. She had won the Charles W. Bryson Prize, given to the senior with the highest scores in gynecology and abdominal surgery. Although some of her male classmates were bound for hospitals specializing in the treatment of women, Scholl did not receive an offer. Eventually, she served as the first female intern at the Los Angeles County Hospital, the site of their clinical training in medical school. While she broke the gender barrier, the hospital only accepted its first African American and Asian American interns in the 1920s. Chung finally obtained an internship at a hospital devoted to the care of female patients and the training of female physicians. She states simply in her autobiography that, quote, Dr. Bertha Van Hoosen of the Mary Thompson Hospital in Chicago heard of me and offered me a job as an intern. Van Hoosen, a prominent surgeon and advocate for women doctors, worked at an institution inspired by Victorian values of gender separatism. The hospital was initially established in 1865 to provide medical services for widows and orphans of the Civil War. It became one of many institutions created during the mid to late 19th century that focused on providing specialized care for women and children. The staff consisted entirely of female doctors who not only cared for the sick, but also trained female interns and nurses. Even as women increasingly attended co-educational medical schools during the early 20th century, hospitals like the Mary Thompson offered much-needed opportunities for postgraduate training. Chung benefited specifically from her mentor's commitment to assisting women physicians of Chinese ancestry. Van Hoosen not only offered Chung a position, but she also appointed the first Chinese women intern at the Mary Thompson Hospital. Born in China, Li Yuan Cao received her training at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. However, Cao was unable to obtain an internship following graduation. Van Hoosen explained, quote, my first acquaintance with Chinese women physicians dates from the time that Dr. Mary McLean came to Chicago to get an internship in one of the hospitals for one of her proteges, Dr. Li Yuan Cao. I wagered that she would not meet with success and told her, when you fail, come back, and we will take Li Yuan at the Women's and Children's Hospital. Disappointed and resentful, she returned to accept my offer. Nevertheless, I began to regret my impulsive bravado and to dread the constant defense of a Chinese intern. I could almost hear such remarks as these. I won't have a chink doctor me. Don't let that foreigner come near me. Why must we have a foreigner when we haven't enough positions for our own women? Despite these fears, Cao's medical and interpersonal skills encouraged Van Hoosen to provide opportunities for other physicians of Chinese ancestry. Chung's internship at the Mary Thompson Hospital in many ways harkened back to her mother's upbringing at the San Francisco Presbyterian Mission Home. Both institutions attempted to train women to assist other women. Both the mission and the hospital, which was located in Chicago's ethnically diverse West Side neighborhood and close to the Hull House Reform Institution initiated by Jane Addams, focused on improving the lives of the immigrant poor. Like the missionaries at the Presbyterian Mission Home, Margaret's mentors used the concept of motherhood to explain why women should exert a protective and nurturing influence over their patients as well as their trainees. Margaret Culbertson, a single woman dedicated to missionary reform, became the surrogate mother for Ah Yang. Bertha Van Hoosen, an unmarried female doctor, referred to internees like Margaret Chung as her surgical daughters. Van Hoosen's commitment to training Chung and other Chinese women physicians reflected the influence as well as the transformation of female missionary efforts. When Van Hoosen appointed Cao as her first Chinese intern, she explained that, quote, at the Women and Children's Hospital, we do not only profess Christianity, we practice it. In other words, she viewed the acceptance of diverse individuals as an expression of Christian values. Not only did Van Hoosen train Asian women in the United States, she also traveled abroad to promote scientific exchange. Retracting the earlier movement of American missionaries overseas, Van Hoosen visited China, Japan, and India in the early 1920s to learn about medical practices in these countries and to offer instruction for Asian female physicians. She was particularly eager to reunite with Sal and also meet Ida Kong and Mary Stone, two of the earliest and well-known Chinese medical missionaries, as well as fellow graduates of Van Hoosen's alma mater, the University of Michigan. Van Hoosen's international interests encouraged her to support a secular version of the religious medical missions. Shortly after she helped establish the American Medical Women's Association in 1915, the organization sponsored health missions abroad to provide wartime, post-war, and emergency medical care. The female missionary movement previously viewed science as a tool for spiritual conversion. Van Hoosen and other members of the AMWA may have been motivated by Christian beliefs and used religious networks to assist their work. However, they viewed the dissemination of scientific knowledge and the provision of medical care as their primary goals. Chung benefited from the commitment of Van Hoosen and other female medical reformers who assisted those on the margins. Their willingness to help, quote, outsiders and foreigners partly stemmed from their personal backgrounds. Van Hoosen's father immigrated from the Netherlands. May Michael, a Jewish pediatrician, vouched for Chung's, quote, good moral and professional character on her Illinois State Board of Health application. Rachel Yaros, another female Jewish physician, eventually helped Chung obtain medical residency. All three of her mentors came from immigrant backgrounds and dedicated themselves to providing medical service and training for women, especially women in ethnic communities. The ethnic and religious backgrounds of Chung's mentors facilitated their ability to empathize with her status as a Chinese American. Nativist movements not only targeted immigrants from Asia, but also those from Europe. As far back as the mid-19th century, exclusionists argued that America should be reserved for the white Anglo-Saxon race. Whiteness, however, did not necessarily correlate with European ancestry. Along with individuals from Ireland, Italy, and other parts of Southern and Eastern Europe, Jewish immigrants were largely perceived as, quote, less than white. They faced a variety of anti-Semitic restrictions and practices that determined where Jews could live, work, and attend school. Being ostracized oneself does not necessarily lead to compassion for other despised groups. While some chose to reinforce discriminatory practices to gain mainstream acceptance, others advocated for racial equality. Chung fortunately came into contact with female reformers who supported accessible health care and training. The Mary Thompson Hospital expressed their outlook in its mission statement that, quote, no person shall be deprived of the benefits of this institution or on account of nationality, race, or religious profession. This is the first slide. So this is a picture of Ah Yang, and I've already described her to you, but what I find really intriguing about this portrait is that there were a number of these pictures that taken of the rescued girls. And as you can tell, she's dressed in Chinese finery. There's markers, there's middle-class markers of status with the furniture. And I think it says something about the conflicted cultural approach of the Western missionaries that she came under tutelage with. On the one hand, it was a culturally imperious project. They wanted to convert her, they wanted to teach her English, they wanted to train her to become a Victorian woman. But on the other hand, they also wanted to make sure that she retained some cultural ties to her Chinese heritage. And I think this is connected with the idea that she could somehow be a native helper, that once they convert these Chinese women, they themselves can become converters within the Chinese community or within the Chinese American community. Okay. So I'd like to move on to the third part of my talk, an Oriental mammy, offerings of meat and rice. With a personal and professional lineage dependent on adopted forms of family, Chung recreated a familiar practice in forming a surrogate family that crossed racial boundaries during the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. White female Presbyterian reformers previously adopted Chung's mother into their missionary family. Chung's mentor, Bertha Van Hoosen, also adopted surgical daughters of varying racial backgrounds and nationalities. Chung's wartime family both resembled, but also differed in important ways from these religious and professional forms of maternalism. First, she reversed the racial hierarchy by assuming the more authoritative maternal role over her white children. Rather than a non-white daughter, she became a non-white mother. Second, she formed her family primarily with men rather than exclusively with women. While the language of family has the potential to incorporate women and racialized individuals into the American polity, traditional concerns regarding gender roles and racialized sexual boundaries also encourage unequal forms of cultural and political citizenship. In the case of Chung's surrogate family, she demonstrated the value of female and Chinese contributions to the war effort by highlighting their roles in maintaining the domestic comforts of white military men. She also included Chinese and Chinese Americans into the political intimacy of the Allied family by reinforcing Orientalist perceptions of Asian culture, racial hostility towards people of Japanese ancestry, and the undesirability of sexual miscegenation. A closer examination of Chung's performances of motherhood, specifically through the provision of physical sustenance, reveals how her model family fulfilled contradictory wartime demands for greater inclusion and continued social hierarchy. In her fascinating study of food rationing during World War II, Amy Bentley argues that the propagandistic image of the, quote, wartime homemaker and the ritual family meal represented cultural performances that revealed how gender, race, and class shaped conceptions of citizenship during World War II. In the iconic family, inevitably white and middle class, the wife or mother's role in preparing and serving food both confirmed female responsibility over the domestic realm and highlighted the value of these contributions in sustaining the war effort. The ideal homemaker, sometimes assisted by a black maid, provides different types of physical and emotional nurturance for her family members, depending on their gender and age. Husbands and sons, perceived as the central constituents of the fighting and workforce, received larger portions, especially of food associated with nurturing masculinity, such as red meat. The mutuality as well as the hierarchy at the dinner table mirrored the ways in which race and gender differences were evoked to promote cooperation for the war effort. While Bentley focuses on the propagandistic image of white nuclear families assisted by racialized female labor, Mom Chung and her family of bastards evokes the different kinship structure. What are the implications of a single Chinese-American surrogate mother physically nurturing adopted white male sons? How might the meals of an explicitly interracial family differ from a normatively white family? What are the implications of Chung's status as an adopted rather than a biological mother? How does serving as a racialized surrogate mother figure compare with the idealized roles of white mothers and black mammies? An analysis of Chung's family meals reveals her efforts to promote mutuality, yet also allay fears of social change in the realms of race relations, gender roles, and sexual norms. Chung's most repeated and hence memorable performances of her maternal identity centered on her weekly Sunday night dinners. Her selection of Sunday supper as the event to showcase her hospitality evoked a connotation of a special family meal. For these weekly buffets, Chung reinforced her maternal identity by cooking the food while, quote, robed in a gingham apron, a costume selection that contrasted sharply with her former masculine professional suits. The menu also tended to replicate dishes consumed by typical American families, such as barbecue spare ribs, Caesar salad, and chocolate cake. Despite the large numbers of guests and the expansive size of her adopted family, Chung sought to emphasize the personal nature of her offerings. She made special efforts to fulfill the request of her son, and she would number her sons. So Tex, son number 632, recalled, "I'll never forget my joy and surprise at just saying I'd like red beans and finding the best ones I've ever tasted right before me." Her thoughtfulness in fulfilling these simple requests compared favorably with institutionalized military fare. As son number 640, nicknamed the Rascal, explained, "Every time we get a dish of Spam or peas, we say something dedicatory to you and your cooking." Chung's famous weekly Sunday night dinners parties alleviate some of the loneliness and alienation of those who were separated from their own families due to the demands of wartime. As one of her sons wrote, "Many thanks, Mom, for everything you did for us those weeks. The pleasant experience of meeting your friends and inhaling tons of garlic-seasoned food at the house was warming to the soul." Like other mothers, Chung expressed her love through the provision of food. By physically nurturing her family, she also spiritually rejuvenated them. While Chung's performance of motherhood demonstrated her Americanness, she also encouraged Orientalist perceptions of her identity to expand the conception of the American and Allied family. For example, she strategically introduced certain types of Chinese fare into an otherwise typically American menu for her overwhelmingly non-Chinese guests. One of her out-of-town friends, a white journalist, recalled, Dr. Chung and I always go to eat at a Chinese restaurant, which represents for her a sacrifice at the altar of friendship. She doesn't like Chinese food, and I do, and she usually eats with American knife and fork while I use chopsticks. While Chung described corned beef and cabbage as her favorite meal, she usually offered fried rice as an accompaniment to barbecue ribs, which she served for large parties, or to steak for smaller parties and special occasions. The symbolic pairing of meat and rice at Chung's parties is significant due to the history of anti-Chinese hostility in the United States. As John Chen persuasively argues, the symbolism of food figures prominently in anti-immigration rhetoric against Chinese people. Charges that the Chinese enjoyed eating rats, dogs, and even other people supported perceptions of their racial inferiority and subhuman nature. Even the American Federation of Labor evoked the cultural connotations of food to argue for the undesirability of Asian immigration. In 1902, Samuel Gompers co-authored a tract calling for Asian exclusion entitled Meat versus Rice, American Manhood Against Asiatic Coolieism, Which Shall Survive? As the United States became the ally of China, Chinese food no longer served as evidence of a despised race. Instead, the act of eating allowed Americans to consume the exotic, thereby demonstrating a sense of cosmopolitanism and internationalism. The cultural diversity of Chung's menu, along with her maternal identity, helped expand her son's conception of family. As her fair-haired bastard number 4, Red Gill, explained after receiving a letter from Chung, "What a wonderful day this has been. How good God is to me. A letter from you is like the October day in San Francisco with chop suey, like the thrill of the kickoff at big game time." And big game refers to an annual football rivalry between Stanford and Berkeley. In this passage, Gill's nostalgic memory of his Bay Area home encompassed Chinese food, as well as the Cross Bay college football rivalry between Stanford and Berkeley. Both chop suey and football served as reminders of what it means to be a San Franciscan, and by extension, an American. Tellingly, Gill's invocation of chop suey reveals how Chung's sons frequently misperceived Americanized versions of Chinese culture as authentic. She encouraged such Orientalist perceptions by giving jade Buddha charms to her sons. These trinkets commonly served as tourist souvenirs without promoting an in-depth cross-cultural understanding of religious beliefs and practices. However, like fried rice, a rather safe introduction to Chinese fare, and chop suey, the palatability of these cultural emblems allowed Chung's sons to expand the imagined home and nation that they were engaged in defending. Not surprisingly, the expansion of national boundaries to include those of Chinese ancestry also entailed the exclusion of those of Japanese ancestry. While Chinese food was rehabilitated for the American palate, the eating habits of the Japanese served as evidence of the depravity and barbarism. As one of Chung's sons explained, "For a long time I thought the Japs inhuman, and now I know for sure. Had heard several tales to their practicing cannibalism. We'll find that it's true. I just hope there's soon a food shortage in Japan." In expressing this sentiment to his surrogate mother, the writer sought to affirm their mutual hatred of the nation and its people that had attacked both the United States and China, her ancestral land by descent and his by adoption. Chung herself fostered these racial hatreds and fueled desires for racial violence. For her sons in the military who were departing for war, she exacted a parting promise in exchange for provisions of maternal comfort. "Bring me back 7 Jap scalps. Get 7 for yourself. Good luck. Let me hear from you." Just as Chung's meals provided cultural and racial instruction for the central constituents of the American fighting force, her maternal role also communicated appropriate gender and racial responsibilities for women. During the war, women of all colors and classes faced increased pressures, described by one historian as a speed-up, to perform both private and patriotic work. As a professional woman who voluntarily chose to nurture a family, Chung affirmed the naturalness of female domestic responsibilities, demonstrated the value of home labor for the war effort, and modeled the ability to balance both roles of wage earner and homemaker. Chung's ability to serve as, quote, a superwoman role model was intricately connected to her racialized identity. First, greater percentages of women of color traditionally participated in wage work compared to white women. Second, Chung's performance of domesticity evoked not only traditional racialized women negotiating family and work obligations, but also their concentrated presence in the occupation of domestic service. As a racialized woman performing domestic duties for her white family, she resembled the figure of the Black Mammy, an iconic figure that appeared in popular culture with increased frequency just as African American women left domestic service to take advantage of the higher paying and higher status jobs during the war. In California, where African Americans did not constitute a sizable population until World War II, Asian American men as well as women were more commonly employed as domestic servants. However, they also left these occupations during the war, either for military service, jobs in the burgeoning defense industry, or involuntary internment in the case of Japanese Americans. In assuming the role of an Oriental mammy, Chung reassured white families that they could count on the devotion of racialized women to secure their domestic comforts. This message appeared in one of the most popular wartime movies, the 1944 production of Since She Went Away, directed by David O. Selznick. His 1939 epic Gone with the Wind had garnered Hattie McDaniel an Oscar for a portrayal of a Black mammy who maintains her dedication to a Southern plantation family even after emancipation. The 1944 film, set during World War II, again features McDaniel as a maid, who demonstrates her patriotism by working at a factory during the day and volunteering her cleaning services without pay for her former white employers in the evening. Like the Black maid, Chung's voluntary services as a war mother communicated her willingness to help share the burdens of white families in the war. While she utilized hierarchical expectations to argue for the value of racialized female contributions to the war effort, Chung also challenged traditional social roles. Simply stated, assuming the title of mother different from the status of maid. To prepare for Sunday dinners and mail care packages, Chung organized and marshaled the labor of her white sons' wives and female family members. In doing so, she reversed the traditional domestic racial hierarchy by becoming the primary maternal figure in her extended family. Her example of serving as a wartime hostess replicated the responsibilities of diplomatic wives that Cynthia Inloy identifies. Among this group, a commonly understood hierarchy or chain of command existed with the wife of the highest-ranking diplomat at the helm. As Inloy explains, the conduct of diplomacy relied on an embassy's senior women being able to mobilize the skills and labor of more junior women. Chung validated the belief that female contributions should focus on the traditional tasks of physically and emotionally nurturing men. Her innovation to the role of diplomatic wife stemmed from the fact that she was not a wife and that her racial identity differed from that of her sons. Chung not only sought to assert maternal authority over white women, she also suggested the possibility of reversing gender and racial hierarchies for her white sons. While the wives assisted in the preparation of the weekly parties, Chung made sure that the men, especially those with the highest rank, cleaned up afterwards. One newspaper article reported, "The rule is that the highest ranker are the helpers, so it is always admirals, commodores, captains, and commanders who clear the table and wash the dishes, while the lieutenants empty ashtrays and run the vacuum." Chung's sons agreed to her rules, which reversed gender and rank order. Even Admiral Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, participated in the cleanup process. One oral history resource recalls seeing Nimitz at one of Chung's parties. That night, I saw Admiral Nimitz there. Naturally, being the highest-ranking naval officer, he had to swab the kitchen floor or deck. He rolled up his trousers a bit, as I remember, and he knew how to handle the swab from his early midshipman days. Women and low-ranking soldiers, frequently men of color in the military, traditionally performed the tasks of cooking and cleaning. By agreeing to share these responsibilities, Chung's white sons paid tribute to the contributions of women in racialized groups, not only in their nights of entertainment, but more broadly speaking to the war effort. The reversal of gender roles in military rank suggests the possibility of transcending traditional social hierarchies. If white male officers could do, quote, women's work, then women and racialized individuals could do white men's work. As a woman of Chinese ancestry who chose not to marry, Chung at first glance was an unlikely candidate to serve as an idealized mother figure for the American nation. However, it was precisely her marital status and racial identity that allowed her to create a model wartime family. As a single woman without biological offspring, she affirmed sexual purity as a prerequisite for female moral leadership. Furthermore, as a woman of Chinese ancestry, Chung provided reassurances that her interracial family resulted from political alliances and not sexual miscegenation. Given the historical associations of Chinese women with prostitution and the opportunities for interracial liaisons during World War II, Chung's asexuality of belated fears that political camaraderie might lead to sexual transgression. While her sons jokingly embraced the term bastard when referring to their fictive kinship relationship to Chung, they also were aware of the negative connotations of the term. The acceptability of the term bastard stemmed from the impossibility of ancestral connections between a Chinese mother and her fair-haired sons. Chung's performances of motherhood, similar to her adopted family's performance of kinship, served as masquerades that highlighted the constructed and not the biological nature of their relationships. I'm not going to talk about this actually I am going to talk about this a little bit in conclusion. But this is a comic book that came out about Margaret Chung in 1943 in a series called A Real Hero. And I just wanted to emphasize the way she's dressed and also the lettering of the comic book. It says at the bottom left, you can't read it very well, but it says in 1898, that particular scene is set in San Francisco, California, but doesn't indicate that she was actually born in the United States, where she was. And the way she's dressed in the letter, it really emphasizes that she is Chinese, that she's exotic, that she's somehow foreign, even though she was born in the United States and was an American citizen. Like all propagandistic figures, and indeed like all individuals, Chung communicated complex and contradictory messages. She created opportunities for recognition and authority for women and racialized individuals who filled traditional expectations of domesticity, exotic difference, and purity. Her focus on personal relationships to redefine political membership highlights two main themes in understanding strategies for racial and gender incorporation. First, her family background, professional career, and status as a political celebrity illustrate the historical importance of kinship in legitimizing unequal forms of membership in the nation state. Within the surrogate families fostered by white missionaries of the turn of the century, as well as the secular female progressive reformers of the early 20th century, fictive kinship represented means for Chinese and Chinese American women to gain inclusion. However, these racialized women, as the adopted daughters, did not necessarily obtain equality within these surrogate families. Even by becoming an adopting mother, Chung had a limited means to completely reverse hierarchical gender and racial relationships. As the matriarch in her family, she helped mold the identities and outlooks of her surrogate sons, and through them, the values of the broader American society. At the same time, her sons, as essential members of the American polity, adopted Chung, granting her legitimacy and recognition by fulfilling their expectations of gender and racial roles. Chung's wartime maternalist strategy, reflective of the longer tradition of interracial female organizing, had enormous symbolic power, but also limited transformative ability. I just want to emphasize the contrast between the way she's drawn in this particular cartoon with an image that was taken of her soon after the war. Chung's maternalist strategy holds a second significance for those interested in understanding the process of social incorporation. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, historians tend to view World War II as a period in which Chinese American women made strides to enter the public realm of work and to move outside their racialized neighborhood. However, Chung's celebrity status suggests that this linear narrative of movement from the private to the public, from Chinatown to mainstream society, needs to be complicated by a more nuanced understanding of the coexistence of contradictory social norms in a period of intense transformation. Chung's strategies for gaining greater gender and racial opportunities often relied upon traditional understandings of orientalized womanhood. That is, people like Chung could gain wartime fame, promote interracial and international alliances, and women's entry into the military because she affirmed the naturalness of motherhood for women, the exoticism of the good Orientals, and the racial dangers of the bad Orientals. Chung's surrogate family suggests that Chinese American women could gain acceptance not through assimilation into the mainstream, but through their strategic embodiment of difference. While Margaret Chung was an extraordinary woman who was exceptional in many ways, I've attempted through this talk and through my biography to make her uniqueness appear less strange. Her life, I believe, sheds light on the resources available to, as well as the limitations faced by other women, especially racialized women, from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century. This is a time period in which they strive to move from the margins into the mainstreams of the American nation. Their search for full cultural and political citizenship often entail not the rejection of difference, but the exploitation of their difference. It strikes me that their efforts to both challenge and reaffirm existing social roles and boundaries were particularly effective during and emblematic of war and empire building. As violence and national boundaries shift, as the imagined community is strained and reformulated, racialized women like Chung sought to take advantage of the social turmoil to make new claims of belonging. At the same time, their performances of patriotism soothed anxieties about gender, racial, and sexual upheaval for societies seeking to reinstate normalcy. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to answer questions, and very interesting comments as well. Yes.
If you're asking a question, making a comment, please turn on your mic. Thanks.
Was there no father figure in her life ever?
You mean, was there a male romantic partner for her? At one point, she was rumored to be engaged, but what I've found in my research is that she also had very intense romantic relationships with women. And so I think her asexuality was a very conscious effort on her part to create a space for her to explore alternative forms of romantic and erotic relationships. And the reason I know about her fiancé is that there was a woman who had a crush on Margaret Chung and was fascinated by her, was one of her patients, and talked about trying to invite her over for dinner, giving her flower, giving her poetry. And she was really crushed when she found out that there's a possibility that Margaret would get married. And the entry in her journal is, "It is bald, but it is wealthy."
I think she was asking about her father.
Okay. Is that the question?
Yeah, I think, that was actually my question too, but, so, did she have a father in the picture?
Yes. In this particular talk, I focus much more on the maternal lineage and the surrogate lineage. But her father immigrated in, I think it was in 1870. He immigrated separately from his wife. At the time, there were many more Chinese immigrant men compared to Chinese immigrant women. And these rescued young girls, in some ways, became very highly desirable marriage partners. So the missionary home reformers would actually serve as a go-between and very likely introduce Margaret Chung's father to Margaret Chung's mother. He also converted to Christianity, became a merchant for a period of time in Santa Barbara, which is where Margaret Chung was born, but like other Chinese immigrants during that very precarious time period, had a very flexible class status. So for a period of time, he worked in the farms. He was a truck gardener. He would grow vegetables and sell them off the back of his wagon. There's a really wonderful picture of him doing this type of activity, and he's reading and wearing a suit. So I think that, again, it says something about the mixed class status, that he has acquired a certain form of literacy, he has certain aspirations of middle class status by his clothing, but at the same time, he's performing very manual forms of labor. And Margaret Chung spoke very highly of both her parents, commenting especially on their Christianity and their dedication to maintaining that religion, even as they experienced very difficult economic and medical situations.
How did she get into medical school?
There's something, again, I didn't talk about, but at the time, USC would allow students who did not have college education to enter medical school. And she was fortunate enough to be in that time period right before medical standards had to be elevated in order to meet the Flexner report that came out, I think, in 1915. So if she had applied for medical school a year or two later, she would not have been able to get in without college education. But she obtained a scholarship to enter USC's preparatory school, and from there she was able to enter medical school.
I was curious about whether her sort of mothering identity carried over into her medical practice. Do you know anything about that in her relationships with patients?
Oh, yes. And as I said, I indicated earlier in one of the photographs that she dressed in a very masculine manner, and especially in her earlier professional career. And people describe her as having very brusque manners, very manly manners. But at the same time, there was also desire to project onto her of a maternal identity. So some of her patients would describe her as having the patience and the nurturance of a motherly figure. And so again, just as I was trying to demonstrate in this talk, she's trying to navigate between gender roles and racial roles. That's also what's going on within her professional career. Oh, just one other comment about her professional career. She was educated in Southern California, eventually established one of the first Western medical clinics in San Francisco Chinatown. She initially went there, I think, with the goal of becoming a medical missionary among the Chinese Americans. Since she could not go to China, she was going to do this among the Chinese Americans. But she had a very difficult time finding a position within that community. She was practicing Western medicine at a time when many of the residents preferred herbal treatments. She was a single woman who had a questionable sexual reputation that she was trying to control and manage. And she also did not necessarily have kinship ties that could incorporate her into that particular community. So what ended up happening is that she maintained her practice in Chinatown, but it was drawing a lot of her patients from outside, from white tourists, or I call them medical tourists, that they wanted to go to her because she was both safe yet also a little bit exotic.
Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious, did she leave diaries, lots of letters? How were you able to research her?
Her papers are at the UC Berkeley Ethnic Studies Library, but I think she's someone who's very careful about what she left within her papers. So going back to this issue of her romantic relationships, there's nothing in her papers that suggests those type of connections. The materials I was able to find about those relationships all resided in archives elsewhere. And so I think she was very careful about going through and deciding what would be her historical legacy. Much of the material that's in the papers has to do with these letters from her adopted sons. And going back to this connection, when her mother was rescued, I talked about her mother expressing thanks to the missionaries as a form of gratitude, as a form of payment. And I see her sons writing to her as another form of payment, right? That now she is the role of it being the adopted mother, and they are thanking her for her hospitality.
How did you first discover Dr. Chung? I don't know whether she's a well-known person before you discovered her.
No, I had never heard of her, and I think when I talk about her, no one else has ever heard of her either. Even though I think she did some really remarkable things in her career. As I mentioned, she's the first American-born Chinese female physician. She helped create ways. There are many aspects about her historical legacy that have not been unearthed. But at the time, I was starting my dissertation, and I wanted to do something related to eugenics and immigration control, and I was wondering if there was a connection between those two movements in the early 20th century, late 19th century among Asian populations in California. And because Margaret Chung was a doctor, I decided to just look at her papers, and she was such a fascinating person that I decided to pursue that as my dissertation instead.
Yes.
Did she ever go to China?
No. She applied to serve as a missionary with the Presbyterian Missionary Board and was turned down. And I think, again, this is a case where she's too American and also too Chinese. The missionaries who went, who were officially sponsored, tended to be white. They didn't necessarily have cultural language skills, but they were officially endorsed by the Presbyterians. For Margaret Chung, she's not white, and also she was born in the United States. So she's in a different position compared to some of the Chinese women who came to the United States to obtain medical skills and then went back to become medical missionaries. Those individuals had the language skills, had the community connections that could facilitate that type of work. So again, I talk about her using her liminality, her in-betweenness to her advantage. In this particular case, she was penalized for being that in-between status.
How did she start these friendships with these young men? How did she meet them?
This is the official version, and I'm not exactly sure what else was going on. But during the late 30s, a group of out-of-work, all-American football players showed up at her practice in her house and said, we heard that you might be able to help us get some sort of commission to fight the Japanese. And I think there's elements in that story that make sense, that she was becoming a local celebrity in some ways because of her medical practice. And I think her sons, who are white, were trying to find a way to get engaged with the Sino-Japanese war effort. At the time, the United States was not officially part of the war effort yet. It was also the Great Depression, so they were out of work, and they were trying to find different ways to sustain themselves. They apparently struck a great friendship. And through that initial network of seven all-American football players, they started bringing their friends, their acquaintances, and that family just kept on growing and growing.
And what had these intense romantic relationships. Who were they?
Well, one of the relationships I have a lot of evidence for is with Elsa Gidlow, and she's been described as the first published lesbian poet of North America. Let me see if I can go back to the first picture. Yeah. So the way Elsa Gidlow, the way she presents herself is very similar to this particular picture of Margaret Chung. A little bit androgynous in her presentation, and it's earlier in Chung's professional and biological life. It's in the 1920s. So I talk about Chinatown and that area as being in some ways a bohemian spot. Chinatown borders right next to North Beach, which is a predominantly Italian community, but it's also the emergence of the first gay lesbian bars in that area. So I think there's kind of an interesting border zone, crossing the borders in that particular area. The second individual that I have a lot of evidence for is with Sophie Tucker. And Sophie Tucker's relationship with Margaret Chung is more similar to this picture. That relationship is more like this period, where you have Margaret Chung adopting the ermine coat, the coiffed hair, the makeup. And Sophie Tucker is a entertainer, vaudeville singer, movie actress. And so this is a slightly older period, a later period. And I think what's interesting about these two women, Sophie Tucker is Jewish. And as I mentioned, there's a connection between Margaret Chung's ability to rise in the medical career with her connections with European in between ethnics. I think there's a personal connection between Sophie Tucker and Margaret Chung, both being outsiders and in some ways having a negative self-perception in terms of their beauty and their body image, and then in some ways making it, becoming more mainstream, becoming stars, becoming much more glamorous. So their trajectory of their lives are really interesting, I think.
Well, thank you so much for a really delightful and fascinating lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.